Hello and welcome back to Archaeology 101. Today's presentation will be on how the dog appeared in the archaeological record and how humans and dogs developed a relationship way back in the Paleolithic. Dogs and wolves split from a common ancestor at least 27,000 years ago, although there are some which claim that maybe this split came at least 40,000 years ago. The wolf and dog populations seem to have had some limited contact between each other, but dogs seem to have had more of a genetic impact on wolves rather than wolves having an impact upon the dog populations. It used to be that there was two groups of dog populations, the East Asian and West Eurasian groups. About 50,000 to 6,500 years ago, there were these two major dog populations. I don't think this really works in today's science, as it's been discovered that there were 5 major dog populations by 11,000 years ago. So this dual origin theory doesn't necessarily work anymore, so it's more likely that dogs were domesticated at different times in different areas and then split into their own lineages. Those 5 major dog populations aren't really seen in today's modern dog genetics, however. What is quite interesting is that dogs have been used to describe where human migrations have come from. So, for example, Siberian dogs were discovered in Northern America, showing how human populations have traversed the lands and also took their dogs with them, which I think is quite cute. Let's get into the social science aspect of why humans domesticated dogs and how. We don't entirely know how dogs were domesticated, but there are some good suggestions. So wolves or proto-dogs may have become dependent on scraps given to them by humans and made them friendlier, and from then on a relationship was established. It has been shown that dogs have more copies of the AMY2B genome, which is in more copies than that of wolves, and it helps the breaking down of carbohydrates, which humans are more likely to eat and share with their animal friends. Alternatively, there may have been the capture of wolf or proto-dog pups, which made them friendlier and friendlier as time went on and became more domestic. There are a whole swathe of reasons why you might domesticate a dog, and that might depend on the different cultures around the world. So there may be a utilitarian demand, so a hunting companion or an alarm system against a predator. Quite grisly, but perhaps dogs could even be used for emergency food. That may not be the primary reason why a dog is kept, but there's always the need that if food is scarce, well, I'm going to have to eat the dog. There are also suggestions that dogs were just kept as pets rather than a functional relationship. And I'll point to the best example we have. So the Bonn-Oberkassel pup. And this seems to be the earliest undisputed dog fossil that we have, which is around 14,200 years ago. And this is a puppy between 19 to 23 weeks, which seems to have had a case of canine distemper, which is a lethal disease in dogs. And it has been suggested that this dog would not have been able to have reached 19 to 23 weeks old, as canine distemper usually kills puppies before that. So there must have been some form of intensive care that allowed this dog to have survived, not for very long, but for longer than it would have in the wilds. The fossil evidence for dogs in the Paleolithic is actually very poor. I've already spoken about the Bonn-Oberkassel puppy, which dated to around 14,200 years ago, but as we stated, the genetics seem to suggest a domestication much earlier than 14,000 years ago. There are things like Grotta Paglicis in southern Italy, which is roughly contemporary, and there seem to be a bunch of canid fossils from this same site, but not all of them can be directly attributed to dogs. But the 3150 specimen from the third metatarsal probably came from a dog about 14,000 years ago. Slightly more dicey evidence comes from the Altai Mountains. The Razboninica specimen from Siberia may have been a very early dog or proto-dog from about 33,000 years ago, but not everyone can quite agree whether this is a dog or not. But that could be one of the oldest fossils that we have of a dog. What's really interesting is what's coming out of the melting permafrost from places like Canada and Siberia. Zur, the grey wolf puppy from Yukon in Canada, for example, is one of those ancient preserved animals, and perhaps we'll get more evidence of dogs this way than from any bone evidence, for example. Whilst I was researching this video, I came across this paper from Nature in 2022, and Bergstrom et al. Looked at all the genetic evidence that they could of dog domestication, and they didn't really make a conclusive answer either, which is so typical of this type of paper, of genetic papers in general. They just can't quite answer the big questions, and they just left it at dogs may have been independently domesticated in East and West, or dogs were domesticated in the East and then went into the West and admixed with local wolf and dog populations. They couldn't distinguish between the two. And I think you should really bear in mind whenever anyone talks about genetics, myself included, that geneticists don't always have the answers, and we can't always provide such large-scale answers just with genetics alone. So if we just look over the research history one final time, there's been heated debate over every aspect of dog domestication, and this has now mostly been fought in the genetics realm, as this seems to have been how we've answered most of the questions so far about dog domestication. Attempts to find the specific ancestor of dogs has been so far very unsuccessful. It's not helped by the fact that wolves were very widely distributed in the past, so their fossils have not been especially helpful, because how do you pick out a fossil which may happen to have all the answers within its genetic code, or has even got its genetic code still surviving within its bones? And it's also not helpful that modern admixtures of dogs make contemporary dogs not particularly useful to tell us what was happening in the past, because they're just so interbred with random mongrel species. And again, the sample of early dog fossils are especially rare, so it's incredibly special when we do find a Paleolithic dog. We are getting closer to the geographic origins of dogs, but it's still unknown, as we have just discussed. But they are making very interesting links about emerging human networks and the gene flow of dog species between different cultures, and making evidence there of long-distance connections. So let's make a conclusion here. There have been lots of new genetic studies being thrown around, and I have put all the links of the studies that I have sourced in my figures and bibliography. There are a very limited number of samples of ancient dogs and wolves, but they are growing in number and quality every year as the science advances. I'm afraid I can't really give you any definitive conclusions of the big questions, as no one else seems to have them either. I would put money on a multi-origin theory of dogs, however. I do believe that strongly, but don't listen to me. There does need to be a series of worldwide discoveries of well-preserved fossils, and even better, ice mummies of dogs, proto-dogs, ancient wolves, etc., so that we can answer these questions, so that we can get both the fossil record and the genetic evidence to put together the big picture of how dogs were domesticated, whether they were multi-origin, where they appeared, and also why. Thank you very much for watching this video. This was very challenging to make, as I had to prize apart genetic papers, and these are really not very friendly to anyone who's not from the genetic world. But I did my best, and I think I came up with at least the basics. Here are the links and the figure links as well, so you can go away and read those to your heart's content. Perhaps start with the 2022 paper from Nature by Bergstrom et al., because that might be a good starting foundation of dog genetics. And I will see you next time on Archaeology 101.